Good morning, everybody. Great to see so many of you, so many familiar faces. A lot of you just from virtual space so far, but it's great to welcome you here to our final conference of, in total, 7 sister projects of the EU Horizon 2020 and LIFE programs, and we come together under the name of RE-energizing Europe, and I think it's a good positive outlook for the next 2 days, what we want to look at. We have many of these projects in the final stages, so I think there's a lot to show from these projects, and it's great that we have a lot of time for discussions and the next 2 days. So my name is Heike Brugger. I am working at Fraunhofer ISI. I'm leading the New Trends project and also involved in the Nudge project, and we'll guide you a bit through the day, what we have planned. First things first, the toilets were searched quite a lot already. They are back there, down the stairs. So no need to go outside. In the back there's the stairs downstairs. Then second thing, you see we have a filming crew here. We will be filming the event, so there's no hybrid version of the event, but all the panels, etc., will be filmed and we will reproduce afterwards so that we have accessible formats to watch later online. So please, if you don't want to be filmed, first, I think in this setting you have your back to the cameras anyways if you're not on the panel. Second, otherwise please inform the colleagues and then we see what we can do, but ideally maybe not jump in the picture all the time if you don't want to be on the camera. That would make things easier in the after production. Okay, what we have planned for today. We have a lot of, as I said, a lot of results already from the projects. We are looking particularly at 3 projects today, MICAT, New Trends and Nudge. So 3 Horizon projects that are all coming to an end. And we have planned the day a bit in 2 halves, so the morning is really dedicated to the scientific part of the whole thing. We have a scientific keynote by Nives from JRC right after me, and then we come to the projects and we will have a more in-depth look at what we did in the projects, what we modeled, what are the key results, etc. We have then 2 colleagues from each of the projects introducing the project results, the most important parts, and also some time for questions and answers on that. And then, as we already realized just now, there's a lot of need for exchange, a lot of willingness to exchange, which is great, and which is also why we brought all of you together here. So we have a long networking session, actually, which is 1.5 hours over lunch. We will have time to network here. We have the lunch, and there upstairs there's also posters hanging from the different projects, so you can have a look whilst walking around and networking. I will also say a bit about the lunch break later. What we'll have in the afternoon is then, okay, what real-life implications, what policy implications do these 3 projects bring to the table? We will have a keynote by Margot from DG Ener and from the Commission joining us, and then the policy implications of the 3 projects. First, again, from a perspective of the projects, and then second, afterwards, we have a larger panel really from policy, including policymakers from the local level, consumer associations, etc., looking at what does this mean, what we've learned in the projects. Okay, the themes of today. First, all of the projects are focusing on the energy demand, so we're really not on the supply side, but on the energy demand side of things. Of course, always at the intersection. It's not so clear-cut anymore between energy supply and demand, but really looking more at this. So this is something that the projects have in common. But then we have really different approaches. We have a systemic approach that we're taking in the MICAT project, really looking at the system as such. We have in Nudge really an individual behavioral approach, and in New Trends also systemic approach with a long-term perspective. So very different perspectives that we're bringing here together and having also this perspective then in the different interactions. And I think that's it from my side for now. The keynote now, as already mentioned, will come from Nives. Nives is currently working at the European Commission at the JRC Research Center, and they're at the behavioral unit. She's a behavioral economist and working exactly also on these topics that we are strongly interested in: energy poverty and energy justice issues. So I'm very happy that she will talk to us what it means to foster also citizen action for just energy transitions, and what this could mean in the context of our projects, and how to empower energy citizenship, also a huge topic of tomorrow's session. Nives, the floor is yours.
So, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the kind introduction and also the invitation. So, my name is Nives Della Valle. I work as a researcher at the Joint Research Center, as mentioned already, in the unit Energy Efficiency and Renewables, where we are many researchers, mostly with an engineering background, but also economists, behavioral economists like me. And it's really an honor to be here today at this event, gathering such remarkable projects that deliver also innovative solutions that tap into the knowledge of human behavior, and how this can help really make more effective energy policies. So this invitation actually gives me also the opportunity to share with you some works that we have been conducting. Some of them are finalized at the JRC. And the perspective that I will take today is mostly the one of behavioral economics, which is my disciplinary backgrounds. But there are also some works that are a collaboration with other researchers, with other disciplinary lenses. And if that is the case, then I will mention that more explicitly. So, as mentioned, I would like to focus especially on citizen action. So, why citizen action is needed to be promoted if we really want to promote the energy transition that doesn't forget also the justice dimension. So why do we need that? Of course, because we are in the context of climate change, as we know. We are all knowledgeable of the need for urgent changes in our behavior as citizens particularly. And in the European Union, this need is, of course, embedded, especially in this ambitious plan, which is the European Green Deal that aims to make the European Union fully decarbonized by 2050. And in this ambitious plan, what is also highlighted is the specific role that citizens and everyone should really take. Everyone should be protagonist, and not to forget the justice dimension. In this urgent need to take action, we also need to take everyone on board. So even though there might be some citizens who might not have the full capacity to take action, then we have to provide them the means to do so. So the justice dimension. But it's not only because we want to reduce the consequences of climate change that we need to take action. We don't have to forget also the energy crisis that we faced last year, and that was reminded us also by the REPower plan. And especially in the communication on energy savings, there are, of course, many actions that are demanded as a way for citizens to take exactly measures and participate to this ambitious plan. So which type of action? Of course, the energy savings communication highlights specifically, for instance, the reduction of energy consumption. This is one way through which citizens can take action. But of course, citizens can also contribute to the energy transition by adopting energy measures that can be simple technologies, but also more costly ones, such as renovation measures. But there actually are many more actions that citizens can take. And for instance, they can stop being merely consumers, but they can start being prosumers. And that means that they can produce energy either individually or collectively. So this is really a way to shape the energy transition. And when there is some amount of energy that is not merely consumed, then this can also be shifted to individuals and citizens who are more in need, as it happens, for instance, through energy cooperatives. So here we are not only achieving environmental and energy goals, but also social ones, if we want to tackle through this energy sharing, also energy poverty, for instance. But actually, citizens can also contribute to the energy transition through their action by taking a more political, let's say, form of behavior. For instance, by talking about the energy rights that need to be taken into account in the energy transition, for instance, in energy debates or in energy cafes. So all these types of behaviors form, let's say, the so-called concept of energy citizenship that might be somehow the guideline of many of these projects that are presented today, and that will be also the focus of some of the works that we have been doing at the JRC. So promoting energy citizenship behaviors is a way to promote an energy transition that is just. But if we really want to make this goal not only an utopistic goal, but a reality, then from a behavioral point of view, more specifically, then we need to take two major steps. And the first one is to identify the main barriers and drivers of energy citizenship behaviors, but also we need to find instruments to promote these behaviors, and we need to find instruments that are effective, because we want to really advise policymakers to find instruments that work before they go on a large scale on a European level. So, talking about, for instance, the identification of barriers and drivers, what do we know from the knowledge that is already there? So, for instance, looking at the energy citizenship behavior of the adoption of energy efficiency that we mentioned is one of many types of energy citizenship behaviors, then we know from the massive knowledge collected from behavioral science and behavioral economic literature that there are identifiable barriers and drivers that can inform policy making. Actually, we also try to synthesize this massive knowledge. We had a go at synthesizing this massive knowledge in a report published in 2021 at the JRC, looking specifically at the barriers and drivers of energy efficiency adoption. And actually, this massive knowledge has also been explicitly acknowledged in the revised directive on energy efficiency that has been recently adopted, where we see that behavioral barriers are explicitly mentioned as key barriers of energy efficiency adoption. And also, among the instruments that might promote energy efficiency adoption, behavior change measures are also explicitly mentioned as key. So this is something that we should be proud of as research, as informed really policy making. But what about the knowledge, the barriers and drivers of which we don't know much about? So here I will start sharing with you only some hints of some works that we have been doing. We wanted to specifically focus on the barriers and drivers of energy efficiency adoption among the most vulnerable. And of course, you might say, of course, vulnerable individuals don't adopt energy efficiency measures because they are simply very costly, so it's simply a matter of affordability. And in fact, it is a matter of affordability. But what happens when the major barrier of energy efficiency adoption for those groups is solved? So let's say that there is a financial intervention that makes those individuals able to then choose whether to adopt or not a technology that enables them to meet their energy need, but at the same time to try to reduce the amount of emissions that are produced on the society. So this is a complex question. Of course, there is no real environment to test this that is clean enough, so we decided to go to the lab and to study really the decision-making determinants of this decision, because we wanted to see specifically what happens among the low-income individuals. And so to simulate this decision, we designed the so-called public bad game, which in a nutshell, I won't go into details, but tries really to mimic the dilemma that might happen once an individual has to decide first of all, which price to take to afford a certain technology. This technology is a way to meet an energy need, such as heating or cooling, and of course, depending on the level of efficiency that this technology has, then there is a certain level of emissions that is produced on the society. of course, usually this efficiency level has a higher price, and so it's also a matter of a moral dilemma. So if I want to pay a higher cost to avoid a higher cost for the society. So we, of course, wanted to focus specifically on the low-income individuals, and we compared what happens compared to a group that has always the financial capability to freely choose whether to adopt or not a technology that is efficient. And we actually surprisingly see that low-income individuals, once provided the financial capability to freely choose whether to adopt or not an energy efficiency technology, they do it even more than those individuals who were always able to choose that technology. So in a nutshell, this study tells us that somehow if we want to target specifically low-income individuals through a financial intervention, then this might work, because then those individuals will choose the technology that is better for the environment and society by paying a higher price. So what happens then in another context in which we also wanted to dig into? So we always hear about this twin transition, so the need not only to make an energy transition, but also the need to accelerate a transition that goes towards full digitalization. And the smart meter technology is one of the most prominent technology that might enable to make this twin transition goal more likely to occur. But still, we don't know much about the capacity of this, let's say, context embedded with smart technology, whether it actually promotes energy citizenship behaviors more or less. And in this case, given the complexity of the question, we decided to join forces also with other disciplinary lenses. So not only here we have behavioral economics, but also sociology, but also geography, transformation scholarship. So it was a very stimulating journey where we tried to combine our lenses and to look at the problem through these complex interdisciplinary lenses. And then as a methodology, we didn't conduct a laboratory experiment as before, but we had instead an interview. So a qualitative methodology where we interviewed directly citizens and also experts. And what we found out is that actually there might be also here identifiable barriers in drivers. As barriers for energy citizenship behaviors, we identify specifically the gap in digital literacy, for instance, but also some concerns related to risk and fairness, the role also of algorithms and loss of agency, because when we automatize some tasks, then individuals might, of course, have a task simplified, but they might actually engage less with energy for some specific behaviors. But there are also some drivers, and here specifically we refer to trust in intermediaries. So this is a way also to make smart technology really an instrument to then engage more in energy citizenship behavior. So this is another study that I wanted to share with you. But as I said before, this is only one of the steps that might help achieve our goal to promote a just energy transition through energy citizenship behaviors. The second side of the story is actually to identify instruments that work. And for that, we really need to find the methodologies that enables to collect evidence that is rigorous. And so here we can have a different methodology, and a specific methodology that might provide that rigorous evidence is the agent-based modeling. Here we decided not to run an experiment, but to conduct this simulation through modeling, because we wanted also to take into account not only the complexity of the individual decision making, but also the complexity of social interactions. And so the focus of the study here was on renovation decisions. So we wanted to simulate which types of interventions might make individuals more likely to adopt renovation measures. And of course, we calibrated data also with the real data from the consumer survey of the European Union. And here we model the renovation decision as a function of social, behavioral, and economic motives. And interventions that we measure were, apart from economic interventions, also pro-environmental campaigns, making salient the environmental benefits of our innovation decision, and normative interventions that in our model were modeled by targeting the most central node in the network, so resembling the idea of the member that is most trusted in the community. And also here we derive some empirical insights for effective interventions that of course need to be calibrated and corroborated by other methodologies, but it's a way to start providing some rigorous evidence on this matter. And finally, this is the last study that I would like to share with you, where we again adopted the experimental approach, which I have to confess is my favorite methodology. And here we wanted to test the effect not of a single intervention, but of a mix of interventions. This is also a question that we asked ourselves, because there might be also the case that a single intervention, like a monetary incentive, might actually have some negative consequences on subsequent behaviors that are actually not directly targeted by the policy itself. And so we wanted to see whether a policy mix that, for instance, combined the monetary intervention also with the normative interventions, whether this policy mix actually is able to contain the negative consequence on the monetary intervention on the untargeted behavior. And this is exactly what we saw, so that here you see what happens on the second behavior that we tested, so the one that was not directly targeted by the policy. And you can see that the monetary reward actually reduced the willingness to engage in the behavior that was not directly targeted. But when we combine it with another intervention, so the normative nudge, then we actually see that the negative consequence is reduced. So again, here we are saying to policymakers that if monetary interventions are really needed for that specific behavior, then it's better to combine it with a normative intervention. And so, to conclude, we can say that energy citizenship behaviors can be promoted. It can be a way to promote a transition that is not only green, but is also just. We have many disciplinary lenses from behavioral economics and social sciences that can enable us to identify barriers in drivers, but also instruments. And we have methodology to say to policymakers which instruments are actually more effective than others. But of course, there are many open questions, like which type of political and social behaviors really need more investigation, especially related to drivers and barriers, and also whether there are other instruments that require more attention. We always talk about nudges, but there are actually many other behavioral instruments of which there is little empirical evidence about, like Boost, Nudges Plus, or Things. And so these questions are complex, require collaboration among disciplines and also different methodologies, and the projects that are presented today actually show that collaboration is possible and can actually produce actionable results for policymakers and research as well. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nives. Thank you very much. I hope you, yeah. All right. Thank you. Okay, we're coming to the next slot, and as already said, in the next slot, we're really having an in-depth look at the three projects that we are looking at here: MICAT, New Trends, and Nudge. And moderated will be the whole slot by Philippos. Philippos is a senior expert at ICP, and he's the coordinator of the Nudge project. That was fast, okay. No time for introduction, all right. Then, yeah, Philippos is working mostly on the implementation, design, and evaluation of energy policies with a focus on energy efficiency, and holds an MSc from Utrecht University, and is here as the Nudge coordinator. And I think you will introduce the panelists yourself, right? All right, the floor is yours.
Does it? Yes. Hello, everyone. So now we're going to discuss a little bit over three projects that delivered some very interesting findings over the past 3 years. So I would like to invite first 6 researchers, 2 from each project that will present. So the format will be as follows. We will have about 20 minutes of a presentation, and then we have another 10 minutes or so for any questions that you might wish to ask. And in the end, if we have time, we can have more of a debate or more questions. So let me invite at this moment directly at the panel Meta Lotz, who is a researcher at Fraunhofer and is representing nutrients. Guys, apologies for my pronunciation. Philip Manschher-Bauer, from TU Vienna, representing nutrients again. Peter Conradie from IMEC for Nudge, and Nan Kesseling, again from Fraunhofer for Nudge. You can take a stage upstairs if you want. Fredrik Berger, representing MICAT from Fraunhofer, and Felix Surekemper from Wuppertal Institute, also for MICAT. So the first presentation is for the nutrients project. Wait, no. Nutrients first. Wait. So let me introduce our speakers. So Meta Lotz is a research associate and a PhD student at Fraunhofer, and is involved with the dynamic modeling of material flows and circular economy measures. And Philip is in his 3rd years of PhD, yes, and employed at the TU Vienna at the Energy Economics Group, and is modeling the energy demand in residential buildings and looking at the influence of prosumers. Please.
Introduction. Yeah, now it's working. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, we're really happy to be here today and present the New Trends project, which is short for New Trends in Energy Demand Modeling. And this is what we're going to talk about today. And I'm not sure in which direction I should point. Is that the right one? Yeah. And I want to start out with a quote, which is from a paper published by some colleagues from me, among others Heike Brugger, who's also here today. And that points out that the path of final energy demand in the coming years is really depending on how societal trends will unfold. And this is really what we wanted to look into in the New Trends project. And we wanted to answer 4 questions. And one of them is, which trends are actually relevant in context of energy demand? What is the role of policies in this context? How do they affect the trends, and how do they impact the energy demand development? Then what impact do the policies and the trends have? And finally, what could this future look like, both in terms of final energy demand, but also in terms of macroeconomic impact? And for this, we did some different things, and we started out with combining foresight methods and quantitative model runs in our project, which was quite new and really brought some interesting results. We used empirical information on consumption patterns and policy impacts, and finally derived an analytical basis for the 2050 energy efficiency vision, considering the impact of new societal trends. And with this, I hand over.
Thank you, Turit. Yes, I want to give a quick overview of how we decided on which trends will be or might be relevant in the future. First, we identified over 240 factors. A factor might be, for example, car-free cities or giving up cash. So little trends that are, that might be influential in the future. And we clustered them through workshops into certain clusters that have a common goal or a focus on a certain sector. And within a second workshop, we decided on which of these clusters or societal trends we will focus within the project, which have the most impact in energy demand, because the impact varies on micro, meso, macro levels. And we want to obviously reach EU climate goals, and therefore we need to, or we view that these societal trends are important to consider in policy making. And to get a full overview, we need to consider also the cross-sectoral impact of these new societal trends. And now, what is the role of policies in this regard? Here we did some desk research and then engaged EU-level policymakers on the model improvements that we could make and asked them, had interviews with them. In stakeholder workshops, we identified over 36 policy instruments and 22 policy needs. And finally, we also investigated 2 smart meter big data consumption profiles from Italy and Poland and tried to include the observed behavior changes of the residents into our modeling activities. And now, how did we improve the models? First, we needed to do a gap analysis, what trends are already included in our models and what is still missing. Then we identified how can we include these new societal trends in our energy demand models. And finally, we did some scenario calculations to estimate, to answer the last question, what impact do these new societal trends have? And with that, I will hand over back to Turit, who will go into...
Yeah, thank you. So we had 4 in-depth studies to calculate scenarios and figure out the impact of these trends. And these 4 in-depth studies is first the move towards a circular economy and a low-carbon industry. Then we had the digitalization in the service sector, so of the economy and the private life. Finally, and additionally, the transition from consumers and to prosumers, and finally, the move towards a shared economy. And I'm now going through, or we are going through these 4 in-depth studies, which were really the core of the New Trends project, where we worked a lot on, and really show you how we improved our energy demand models and what we found with our scenarios. And we're starting with the move towards the circular economy in the low-carbon industry sector. We've improved our model by developing a bottom-up material flow model of the EU building value chain. Now you may ask, why buildings? Buildings really are one of the main demanders of steel and cement in the European Union. And we could see from the reference scenario development that the demand for steel and cement will grow in future. And you can also see in that depiction of the bottom-up material flow model, the different material loops, R loops as we call them, that may impact the future material demand. So this is really from the 2050 scenario considering circularity. And what you can't see in this graph is the measures of the circularity measures that actually impact the demand of materials, which may, for example, be the lifetime extension of buildings. And when calculating these scenarios, we looked, for example, at a mixed scenario that could reduce the steel and cement demand by 38 or 26% until 2050. But please note, that's not the total demand, but the steel and cement demand for buildings. And while cement makes a huge share of the material demand for buildings, there are also cement demand for other sectors. We can see that thus circular economy really contributes to achieve the climate targets for the industry sector. But what we also saw in an extra policy case study, which we did in that focus study, that the current policy mix is insufficient to exploit these potentials, and that especially the green public procurement may have an important role in the short term. But I want to point out that we are discussing policies this afternoon, so if you want to discuss about this, we can do it this afternoon. The second focus study I want to talk about is the digitalization of the economy and private life. So we're talking about the service sector, where we included 3 digitalization trends in the forecast model. And these 3 are smart buildings, data centers, and e-commerce. And for the smart buildings survey, that these can reduce the energy demand by 2 to 3% until 2050. And you can also see in that figure, which is an example for that specific trend, that how the diffusion of ventilation applications in context of smart buildings were modeled in 3 different scenarios. Additionally, we also looked at the data centers that actually could increase future energy demand by about 12%. And then finally, we looked at the trade-off between e-commerce and conventional trade, which again could reduce the energy demand by around 17%. And then I hand back over.
Thanks. Yes. So the transition from consumers to prosumers we tried to investigate the impact of prosumers on energy demand, and prosumers, we call them prosumers, they are not prosumers. They're basically consumers who do not only produce energy, they also manage their own energy demand, and they try to minimize their energy costs. And to calculate the impact or possible impact of these prosumers, we have two models that we extended, the primes model and the invert model. The primes prosumer model focuses mainly on the investments these prosumers may do in the future. Will they invest more in building renovation, in different heating systems, or PV, for example, and what subsidies are needed for the building stock to reach climate neutrality in 2050. Whereas in the invert extension, the flex model, we looked more into the behavioral changes of these prosumers. How will the electricity demand change if they really try to reduce energy costs? And we saw that they can actually shift a lot of electricity throughout the day, and variable electricity tariffs are an effective tool to incentivize these prosumers to shift electricity. Just to give an example, what we see here is the total electricity demand in France in 2019 for 3 days, end of January and the first day of February. And on the right-hand side, you can see the wholesale electricity price, and this price gap, or this change in price, is already enough to, if these prosumers, these are buildings with electrified heating systems or electrified boilers, if they would shift their demand to low, times with low prices, which would drastically increase the electricity demand when prices are low. So you can see with the red marked area, and then in the upcoming times the demand would be significantly reduced, and this shows how big the potential actually is of the whole building stock to shift electricity demand. Of course, we would need more smart meter rollout and smart devices to do so. Towards a shared economy, here we looked into the implications of shared mobility and also shared workspaces or different work trends. For that, a new model was created, the Primes shared mobility model, and the forecast model was enhanced by new work trends like home office, shared co-working space, and so on. And in these scenario calculations, we saw that in the short term, carpooling will be the first choice, the more prevalent choice, but long-term car sharing will be more important for these shared mobility services. On the left side, you can see a graph of the occupancy rate of passengers per vehicle, and basically the difference between the dotted line and the straight line shows how much more occupancy rate through car sharing can be achieved, or through shared mobility can be achieved in two different scenarios. And with teleworking and shared spaces, we saw that this trend will reduce energy demand in the service sector, or might reduce energy demand in the service sector by 4 to 8%, which is quite substantial. However, some of this electricity demand or energy demand will spill over to the residential area, and thus we see a small increase in the residential sector due to these trends. Now, what could the future look like on a macro perspective? Here, in total, we created 4 scenarios. One scenario focused on the decarbonization of the building stock until 2050, so we had some boundary conditions in our model runs. And the other scenario was the reference scenario, where we say we have policy implications as is, and we do not reach climate neutrality in 2050. And on top of these 2 scenarios, we now consider them once with these new societal trends, where we build the model extensions, and without these trends, to see the impact of these trends. And when we look at the final energy demand of the EU as a total, we can see here in the reference case, 2050, we have a slight decrease in final energy demand. If we consider these new societal trends, this decrease is a bit bigger. However, in the decarbonization scenario, we have a quite substantial decrease in energy demand, and the new trends add on top of that. And with that, I will go.
So now we come to the final slide, the final content slide, where we look into how the future could look like from a macroeconomic perspective. And I want to say that we're really just looking into the trends that I just presented, or we just presented for the focus studies. So don't think that's the overall economy that we can display here, but it's really about the trends that we looked into. And for the circular economy, we can see that the material production is reduced. This increases the competitiveness of industries and increases the household disposable income, decreases the import dependencies, and this is why we have a positive impact on GDP and employment for circularity along the building value chain. When looking at digitalization, you might remember that we also had some trends that might increase the energy demand. This is why we have a net neutral impact on GDP and employment with this focus study. And for the prosummation, we see a small but negative impact on GDP and employment. This is due to the cost of service that are related to prosummation, and also some import dependencies for technologies such as photovoltaics. For the shared mobility, again, we see a positive impact on GDP and employment, but just a small positive impact on these indicators, because we have an increased resource efficiency. We're using our resources more efficiently. And on the other hand, we are also decreasing the import dependencies for the fossil fuels that are needed for the transport sector. Overall, we can see that if we combine these four trends in the scenarios that just were presented by Philip, that the GDP might increase between 0.1 and 0.7%, and employment between 0.0 and 0.1%. So the overall trend is the same for all the four scenarios that we looked at, or for all the scenarios that we looked at, but we can see that there are differences between the decarbonization new trend scenario and the individual new trend scenario. And finally, I want to point out that this is of course not all what we did, but you really have to check out our website for all the publications, and also follow our project on LinkedIn, because not all our publications are online yet, and so you don't miss anything. Please follow us on LinkedIn. And you can also check out the websites of the different modeling teams, so from the GEMI 3 model, the PRIMES model, the forecast model, and the inward model, because there are always a lot of interesting projects going on. And I really want to highlight that last QR code. So this is all that we did within New Trends. So the models and the data sets that we developed within New Trends can you find behind that last QR code. But of course, not yet everything is published, so please keep yourself updated when these things are going to be published. And then I think we're ready for questions. And thank you.
Thank you both for the very good presentation, I have to say. While questions are being prepared, there's one I would like to ask about the models that you used. If, for example, you wish to say something more about forecast or one of these that apparently you use to a very good degree. For example, I was looking at forecast and I was wondering how you introduced the digitalization part in it.
Okay, yeah, I can try to answer that. So the digitalization study was done by our project partner TEP, but I'm still very familiar with the forecast model because it's also the model that we use at Fraunhofer ISI. The forecast model includes the different sectors, for example, industry, but also the service sector, and we have like a sectoral structure within the forecast model. And for example, the trend on e-commerce and was considered by introducing another subsector into that sectoral structure to model the impact of the e-commerce activities on the energy demand. Looking, for example, at the smart building technologies, again, it was modeled quite differently because the forecast tertiary, as we call it when we talk about it internally, considered different energy savings options that are like the uptake is defined by diffusion rates. That was the graph I showed before. I can also try to show it. Maybe that takes too long. But it's defined by diffusion rates and how these technologies are taken up. And for the smart building technologies, just new energy saving options were included into the model and could be considered for the energy demand reduction, for example. Yeah, so maybe that as an example, and I see that there's another question.
Okay, Matthias Weiland, on behalf of the Environment Agency in Germany, Umweltbundesamt. Two short questions. The first is quite going in the same direction. I was wondering how you integrated resource aspects into the model, because when we did in Germany at the UBA, we did our rescue study, we looked at resource aspects as well, but there still it was two different models or several different models, but it was two different approaches which we had still to use. So the question would be if you could just elaborate a bit more how you integrated these resource aspects or material aspects into the model. And the second one is whether you looked as well at the kind of maybe behavioral change as a trend on its own, or as you have seen in the energy crisis last year, energy crisis in hyphens, this could be a trend as well to have rising prices, or whether you have had this as a kind of trend on its own. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you for these interesting questions. Actually, I'm quite familiar with the rescue study, so I might be able to answer this. So we used a material flow model, a bottom-up material flow model, specifically for the building value chain, and this is what we did to improve the model or the data that we use on the material demand. Right now, we are also using other modeling approaches to create input for the forecast model. We're also having a top-down, not a bottom-up material flow model to look at all the industrial sectors, to have the full sectoral coverage, and combining these two approaches, like the bottom-up and the top-down approach of material flow modeling to generate input for the forecast industry model. We're really focusing on the material demand. We're not considering other resource aspects like, for example, scarcity that might be relevant in such studies, but we've also done so by adding, like in other projects, by adding Axio-based parameters into the calculations to figure such things out. If you're interested in this, we can also have a discussion during the networking session, because I think that might be a bit out of scope of the energy demand reductions we are looking at right now. For the second questions about the behavioral trends, I would hand over to my colleague.
Yeah, that was about behavioral trends and electricity prices, right? So for the behavioral trends, we analyzed 2 smart meter data analyses in Poland and in Italy that was taken during the COVID pandemic as well, and we tried to segregate these behavioral changes from the smart meter data. However, for the price changes, we looked specifically for the presumages. We tested different price structures, different price hourly electricity prices that change in volatility to see how they incentivize load shifting and how much energy cost reduction can be achieved through different price structures, and also how different overall mean electricity prices affect investment decisions of presumages. For example, high electricity prices will drive up PV investments. Heat pumps will go down, obviously. So yes, does this answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Job Swens, GOB, Energy Law Consultancy. I have a question. You used employment and GDP as references or as instruments to measure against, but this does not really go in line with what more and more people begin to think less is more. This is, say, the conventional economic way of looking at growth in a sense which I think a lot of us are not looking at anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very valid question, because I think that's actually also some of the discussions that we had internally. So we just used GDP and employment as indicators for our macroeconomic calculations. So it's just an indicator we use to compare the scenarios. We would not say that these are the indicators that really describe or define how our future will look like. Because especially when we're looking at the circular economy trend, I think one of the main aspects when looking at circular economy is that we hope to decouple the resource use from the GDP growth. So maybe actually that might not be the perfect indicator to grasp that aspect.
Okay. I want to build a bit on this question here. I mean, for example, a conclusion like digitalization has a neutral impact, let's say, I mean, you can ask the question, I mean, digitalization is everywhere in where we are, and there are so many business models which are created, and in a way, exactly, right, you would say all this creates GDP. We can ask the question about the relevance of this, but intuitively I would say that's a bit counterintuitive and maybe needs some more explanation, maybe making more stronger link to the digitalization and the energy use. And maybe on the point, a comment still on the models, we had a lot of discussions whether the models are already appropriate to reflect these choices. And this sentence you said, less is more. I mean, our macroeconomic models show if we buy less cars that we get poorer, but they don't show yet maybe things that we replace when we buy less cars. And I think there is, from a methodological point of view, still a lot of lack. But handing over to you on this.
Yeah, so I think that's also what I wanted to say when I introduced that slide. We're really looking at the macroeconomic impact of the trends that we considered in our focus study. So when I'm writing digitalization here on that slide, it might be a bit too short to actually represent what we are talking about. We are talking about digitalization in the service sector for 3 specific trends. So we're looking at smart building technologies, the e-commerce trend, and the data centers. And when we're looking at these 3 aspects and combine them, then we see that net neutral impact on GDP. And I agree, probably if we would consider digitalization across all sectors and across all the impacts, the results might look different than they do now.
A very quick question.
Good morning. Didier Bosbeuf from ADEME, the French agency for ecological transition. If I have well understood, your results are at EU level. So you don't have any result at national level. If not, how you can see your conclusions are strong enough for national policies? The second issue, you didn't mention what kind of macroeconomic model you use. In France, we have 2 different models, one neoclassic and one post-Keynesian, and the result on employment and GDP are opposite. The main reason is in a post-Keynesian model, we recycle the CO2 tax revenue. So you should mention what type of modeling you are using. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if you want to. But yeah. So, yeah, I think to the first part, I think we have EU level results, but we are modeling on a national level. Regarding the modeling type, I would hand over to our macroeconomic modeling expert, Leonidas, because he already raised his hand.
Okay. So the model is GEM3. It's neoclassical. What I want to here also to clarify is that, for example, the digitalization, the focus was on the impact of the energy demand. So it's not about the productivity that you would gain if you digitalize or your service and so on. So this has to be clear here. And on the same respect, the model has some, let's say, short-term, let's say, disequilibrium, but in the long term, it's an equilibrium model, neoclassical.
Thank you both for the excellent presentation and for the very good discussion and questions. Let's move on to our next presentations for the Nudge project with Peter Conradi and Anne Kesseling. So, quick introductions. Peter is a senior researcher at IMEC in Belgium, and he works mostly on determinants of sustainable behavior and the adoption of sustainable technologies. And Anne is a senior researcher at Fraunhofer ISI with a PhD in economics, works on energy economics and environmental policy. And within Nudge, he has contributed mostly to the analysis of smart meter data connected in the randomized control trials. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Philippos. Good morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Peter. I'll be talking about Nudge project. So Nudge, it's a very on-the-nose title, so it says what it does right there in the name. But what it stands for is nudging consumers towards energy efficiency through behavioral science. So before we dive into the results, very briefly, nudging, I think most of us are probably very familiar with it, but the textbook definition of nudging is any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any option or significantly changing their economic incentives. So I think, I think many of us have a smartphone or a smartwatch, and there are examples of nudges there. So if you are sitting too long, you might get a notification to remind you to stand up. If you go to the supermarket, you might see that certain foods are placed strategically closer to incentivize you to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. But we also have other types of nudges, for example, social influence nudging, where you are shown what other people are doing, and through doing that, the assumption is that you will change your behavior based on what your peers are doing. So what did we do in the project? Objectives. First of all, we have a intervention design tailored to the context. So we have a digital mediation where we show the nudges to the participants. This has been rolled out in field trials across Europe. We have 5 field trials in total. We also have a systemic research protocol where we gather the data continuously to see how the behavior changes. And finally, we translate this to policy recommendations that try to consolidate and summarize the findings. So of course, when we talk about nudging, a nudge by itself, you need to deliver it, right? So you need some sort of delivery mechanism for people to be able to engage in a nudge. So first you need a tool. So typically that might be an application, but an application is not enough. You also need people to use the tool. So you need some sort of way to know, are they seeing the nudge? And finally, you need to kind of combine these two so you know that they are using it in the context of their daily life. So the effectiveness of the nudge depends on this channel through which we see, first of all, the intention or the motivation to behave differently, and then this translates to the behavioral change. This also introduces 3 broad results, data results. So first of all, we have trying to understand the intention of people to change their behavior. This was done through classical survey results. A survey of 2 people have the intention to change their heating consumption. This is followed up by tracking whether they use the particular apps that we developed to see, do they see the nudge? And finally, you have the sensor data that tracks whether they have actually changed their behavior. So do we see a change in consumption or self-consumption? The pilots themselves are across 5 locations. 4 of them we have a use of the smartphone, the web, dashboards and smart devices. So the colleagues in Greece and Portugal focuses on the reduction of heating consumption, while in Germany and Croatia we focus on self-consumption of PV electricity. And then in Belgium we had a special case where we have a school course and where we try to find out if we teach the children about energy consumption and reducing energy consumption, does that translate to reduction in energy use at home? In all cases, we have various nudging being presented. So 3 nudging interventions in the first 4 pilots, and then in the final pilot in Belgium, we have 2 cohorts that are being measured to see if their behavior changed based on the courses that the children received. And in all the pilots, we gather sensor data followed by survey data and device data. So this is an idea of the complexity that we faced also in the timing. So we see here the German pilot. So already in 2020, we started the acquisition of participants, development of the nudges, where in the end of 2021, we sort of had the pre-intervention phase, where in some cases we were already tracking consumption data. Then in the middle of 2022, we sort of had the phase 1 and phase 2, and then finally phase 3 in 2023, where we had the final nudges being implemented. So the planning for the other pilots will be broadly similar, but it's just to give you an idea of the length. And also we have various waves of qualitative surveys that ask people about how they experience the project, do they intend to reduce consumption, etc. So the nudging interventions, more specifically, we plotted them here. So you see we have quite a focus on the feedback and awareness nudges, so showing people certain information about their consumption. Gamification and target setting was also used by us. Just-in-time prompts, for example, in the Portuguese pilot. And also an interesting one is the default setting in Germany. And then, of course, the Belgian pilot, which is a bit different, where we have, strictly speaking, no technology usage, but more related to the pupils as the actual, you could say, nudge to change the behavior. So what does the nudges look like? So these are some screenshots or mock-ups from the project. So this one is the instigating empathy nudge that was rolled out in Croatia. And you see the earth and the pollution increases as the carbon emission increases or your self-consumption decreases. We have the example here of the feedback nudge, which was done in Germany. So here we focus on self-consumption. And you see here very visually the self-consumption level, so the level of autarky, 100%, but also simple indicators and reference values to help people better understand the impact of their behavior. So for example here, the amount of carbon they saved because of more self-consumption, for example, the e-auto distance they could have traveled. And then a final example here is the push notification, contextual push notifications that was being done in Portugal. So here you see reduce your default space heating temperature by 1%, by 1 degree, but also a temperature alert that is going to increase in temperature so you can lower your thermostat setting. So get back to the data. You recall we have broadly three types of data that we present in the paper. The first one is the more classic survey data, which is then combined with the application data, and finally the sensor data. So the results part one, I think, points to some interesting results already with the surveys. So the perceived ability of people to reduce their consumption is very predictive of their intention to do so. So that might sound very obvious, and it kind of is, but it also points to very important things that can be done to increase the amount of energy that people can save. And this deals with showing them how much data or how much energy they are consuming, but also this has an effect on their energy-related knowledge, which is another predictor of reduced consumption. Because if you don't know what you're consuming, it's very hard to see how your behavior impacts your final bill, especially in cases where you only get you have to only pay at the end of the year. So it's very unclear to people to see what the impact of their behavior will be. Social norms also remain very important, so emphasizing normative values related to energy consumption is also an important thing to consider in communication with people. And then there's also a balance to be found between your attitude and your comfort. So we see that the fear of losing comfort as a negative association with your intention to reduce consumption. So you always need to consider there's sort of a limit to how far people will be willing to go to reduce their consumption, and this is very dependent on the person. Some people maybe feel fine with 19 degrees at home, but other people have it needs to be 20 or 21 degrees indoors. So this is the results of the survey, and now I hand over to my colleague Anne, who will talk more about the app data and the sensor data.
Yep. Okay, so yeah, we saw some results already in the survey data, and then the second question for us is how do people actually use the tools that we give them? And so what we find in the app data is a somewhat limited and for sure very individualized usage pattern. And this that people differ is called heterogeneous response in science speak. So that's what we find. In all cases, there's always a group of people who don't interact with the digital tools at all. They're non-respondent. That ranges from 5 to 25%, but it's always there. And then beyond those non-respondents, the distribution of usage patterns is really wide. And I will go through this with the example of the third nudge in the Greek case, just to have a concrete example. And that's what you see in those three graphs. So at the bottom first, you have a table that just shows what percentage of people use the app at least once, like at all. And that in the Greek case is about 3/4 of people. And then in the middle, you see what the distribution looks like. So this is the number of days that people were active on the app. And you have on the left side this block of people who were non-respondents or use it very, very rarely. And then there's a middle bulk of people who use it once a week or a few times a week. And then we have a few heavy hitters on the far right who are on this app pretty much daily. But just being active on the app doesn't mean that all of these people were effectively nudged, because typically the nudges are delivered through specific pages within the app that convey this information. And so when we restrict activity to the pages that actually contain the nudge, that's the final graph, you can kind of see that this right part of the distribution somewhat disappears. So for us, at first, of course, it sounds a bit disappointing because so much effort went into designing these tools and setting up these nudges. But it's a really important lesson as we move from evidence in the lab to what we find in the field, because people have busy lives to live and their behavior doesn't revolve around energy saving 24/7. And then the final part of the results is the sensor data, so the smart meter data evaluation. And for us, this is where the heavy lifting in terms of statistical analysis occurs. So in very short, what we find is here the answer to the question, is nudging effective? And the answer is, well, it is effective in some cases, but not all across the board. In the cases where we do find positive effects of the nudging, the effect size ranges from about 0.5% to around 4%. And there's an outlier, the German smart charging nudge, that delivers even up to 15%. But when we look at all the evidence across all the pilots, we really find no consistent evidence for the effectiveness of nudging. And that is summarized in this table here, where you have all the pilots, and then the dark green check marks are, okay, nudging was effective here. The light green is, well, it was a mixed evidence. And the dash says, well, we found no evidence here for the effectiveness of nudging. So in a nutshell, in 2 out of 5 pilots, we find no evidence for the effectiveness of nudging. And in 5 out of 5 pilots, we find at least some subgroup or intervention where we have either insignificant or even counterintuitive results. So now what do we do? Now what? What can we say? Well, there's a lot to be learned by really digging into this mixed bag of evidence and trying to understand the explanations of why nudging is not effective all across the board, but it does work in some cases. The first one is the somewhat limited usage of the apps that I talked about on the previous slides. Because as a statistical analyzer, I estimate the average treatment effect across everybody who was in the treatment group. And so these non-respondents, or people who rarely use the app, really weigh me down in my statistical ambition. And then the second thing that we find is that, well, nudging by definition is a soft intervention. And our findings show that it gets easily drowned out by external factors in people's choice environment. This can be holiday seasons, the weather, the energy crisis. And what our results really show in these statistical models is that these factors matter a lot in explaining energy behavior in general. So then the nudges easily get dominated by these big external things. And this idea that the nudges get dominated by other factors also relates to other policies. Nudging is not like a loud roar. It's more like a little tap on the back. And it does not work when there are regulations or big incentives that tell people to do something different than what the nudge is quietly whispering. Okay, so in the end, what we really contribute here with the Nudge project is this ambitious field trial over 1.5 years that we analyze rigorously, also looking at the external factors, and with the advantage of really combining these 3 data sources to look a little bit more under the hood of what's happening when nudging is applied in people's everyday lives in the field. And what we do not want to do here is to give an econometrics lecture of how we actually do this, but we do want to go a little bit deeper into the insights. So we've selected 3 examples where you can really see how this, these main findings look like in the data. So, other way? Well, here we go. So the first example is the German nudge. That's a default nudge, and it revolves around prosumers that have their own PV production, and then they're nudged to charge their car when they have excess PV production. So in the raw data, we see here a single participant. The red curve is their self-consumption throughout the course of the day before the nudge was activated, and then the yellow is the series after activation. So we can really see how self-consumption shifts into the midday hours where there's a lot of solar radiation. And the statistical analysis confirms this. Here we find that the nudge increases self-consumption by 15%, specifically during the midday hours, for those people that activated the feature in the app. The catch is, not everybody activated it. There's still a substantial fraction of people who just did not use the feature in our pilot. The second example is from Croatia. I keep doing this. The second example is from Croatia, and here we have the case of a nudge that did not work, but we can kind of pinpoint the spoiler, and it's the regulatory setting. In Croatia, there's a regulation where prosumers that have a surplus at the end of the year are put into a bad regulatory status. Surplus means they produce more energy than they consume over the course of the year, and bad regulatory status means it's extra financial and administrative burden. So these prosumers do not want to have a surplus at year end. And there are two ways to achieve this. If you get near the end and you see you have a surplus, well, you either decrease your production or you increase your consumption. And looking at the data, we see both. So at the top here, you have a consumer, and the red part of the curve is what happens near the end of the year. And this prosumer just shut off their PV plant. They just went cold. And then at the bottom, we see a different consumer, and they went the opposite route. There's a drastic increase in consumption here near the end of the year. Typically, people do this by switching heating to electricity-based heating. And so clearly, neither of these things really align with what we were trying to suggest or convey through the nudge. Consume less energy, use more of your own PV production. The regulatory setting dominated. But there's also an important positive lesson here that the nudge tools created a way for people to monitor and track their status relative to the regulatory setting. And then the last example is from the Belgian pilot. So here it's a little bit different because the nudge was through courses in schools, and we did this for 2 cohorts. The blue is the first cohort. So here we have an individual participant, and you kind of see how there's the period around the delivery of this course. So this is what we deal with in the raw data, and then we transform this into a statistical effect. At the bottom, you have the same for a participant in the second cohort. And then when we look at what that actually looks like in the statistical evaluation, we see that the nudge decreased energy consumption for the first cohort, following the expectations, but it seemed to increase in the second cohort. And so when we take a step back and we look at what happened here, well, the second cohort got this nudge before Christmas. And so we think it's very likely here that the timing just ate away any effects that the nudge might have had because people disappeared on their holidays where other things then dominate how behavior is shaped. Okay. So yeah, with this, let me close. So here are the 3 main takeaways from the nudge project. And for this, it's very useful to go back kind of to the definition of nudging as a choice-preserving, low-cost tool. This choice-preserving idea is a very appealing feature also in policy settings because people don't like to be forced. We don't like to be forced to pay taxes, to turn off our heating, whatever it may be. But what our project shows is then these softer interventions easily get lost in the mess of everyday life. The second point, the low cost, still stands. Like, once the smart metering rollout is done and the tools, the digital tools are set up, then it's fairly low cost to set up nudging interventions. So even small effect sizes can be very cost-effective policy interventions. And in the end, the sort of summary from the project is, well, behavioral interventions do work, but we have to be realistic about how they can be used within a policy portfolio. Nudging can only take you so far. It cannot substitute for other policy measures, especially when they might be contradicting, like we saw in the Croatian case. And it certainly cannot be a one-size-fits-all measure, but we can really think about how nudging can be a complement within a bigger policy portfolio. And I think that's what the policy session will be about this afternoon.
Great, thank you both. Any questions that we might have? 1, 2, 3, 4. and maybe well, we'll have an extra one afterwards.
On. Hello, Florian von Hong from Wuppertal Institute. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I was wondering if you had considered introducing a competitive element in the nudging, where you introduce comparative values to other households or something, which is something that has worked in the past.
So the social norm nudging is something that we spoke about a lot. There are some interesting things that as a background, when we did focus groups and qualitative work beforehand, we found that people were very skeptical of the accuracy of this kind of nudging. We know from the theory that it works, right? It has huge effects, but it's also much more complex to do because you need to compare your consumption with other people. And also there's a lot of literature already available on the subject, so we kind of made a decision to say we will not do social comparison nudging because it's kind of clear that it has a strong effect, and we wanted to focus on other things. But I still think the discussion that we had with in the focus groups, and this was universal, and we did it in Greece and in Portugal, in Belgium, in Germany, people are very skeptical about whether their consumption can be compared to other people. And one example that was really funny to me is some lady said, yeah, I have long hair, so I use my hairdryer, so my consumption cannot possibly be compared to other people. So there's this really interesting disconnect between what people think their behavior is, but we know from literature that the social norms nudging is quite effective. Yeah.
Fascinating project. Just connecting to the last sentence that you said, one size fits all doesn't work. Maybe you have already done that, but are nudges not effective also for specific groups, or you just looked at the average effect? Because I was thinking also at the heating behavior or energy consumption, so there might be also some disabled who can simply not reduce energy consumption or have to keep a certain heating temperature. And second question, the digital tool, the app with which citizens didn't interact at all. Perhaps with a bit of co-design, could it be different, perhaps? Because sometimes it's really a top-down app that we think is useful, can be user-friendly, but maybe a bit of inquiry before might reduce this low engagement. Thank you.
Yeah, so for the first question, this part about like subgroup analysis, basically, well, there are two parts to this answer. One is that we really found that there's so much externally going on that we have to put a lot of statistical rigor in being confident that we identify nudge effects here. And then that constrains you in terms of power when you want to do more heterogeneity analysis. Of course, we tried a lot of things there, and our impression from the data is really that it's difficult to do a proper split for people into just two groups, because it seems that their energy consumption behavior and their responsiveness to the tools is multifactorial. So it's like we cannot even say that the people who are the most motivated, who report the highest intention in the survey, are the people who use the tools the most. And so then it becomes really difficult to explain, because it seems like it's not like a simple split between these are the people who respond and those are effective. And that's kind of a big takeaway from us trying to dig into this, given the power constraints. And then for the second question, sorry, can you repeat again?
Yeah, so we planned co-creation sessions, and we in fact did this. We went locally to all the pilots. But I think I mentioned it earlier, I think for many people, this is not so top of mind. You know, it's not something that you are that engaged with. We are engaged with it, but for many people, they have no idea kilowatt hour. They pay their bills and that's it. And before the energy crisis or the rise in prices, I think most people, I mean, the share of your cost as your monthly income for many people, not everyone, but many people, was simply too low to care. That changed after the Ukraine war, but I think it's not something that many people are so engaged with, to be honest.
Yes, my name is Christian Klöckner. I'm at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and I coordinate a sister project of Nudge, which is called Enchant, and I'm very happy to see that you have the same kind of results and interpretations, and also the same kind of challenges, like motivating people and being able to find out what is the effect of our interventions and what is the effect of everything else that is going on, because we had the projects in a time when the energy market changed drastically anyway. So it's really hard to find any results, but we have a bit larger numbers of our intervention groups, and what we see is super interesting, that if you look at treat it as planned, like compare the groups that were randomly assigned, then you often do not find effects. But when you, for example, ask people for a commitment, do you look at who commits and who doesn't commit, then it almost splits. So the people that commit, they actually have a saving effect, but that is eaten up by the people that don't commit and increase their consumption. The same for competitions. When we introduce competitions, the people that accept a competition, for them it's really successful. But the other ones, they eat up the effect of this. And there are even more complicated interactions there. So when you look at social norm interventions, or nudges as you call them, we can see that they work for some people quite well, but for people that are internally motivated, they can also be counterproductive, like reducing their motivation to save energy. So I think creating even larger data sets where we can go more into these details is something that would be really interesting, because it's even more complicated than we behavior scientists thought 3 years ago.
Completely agree, and I think that what we found also again during the qualitative work was exactly what you describe here. So someone would say, feel very motivated by the financial aspect, whereas someone else might say, I really don't care. Like, I just pay. I care more about the environmental aspect. So it's really hard to then you develop your nudge, and it's based on a theory, and there are some papers that show an effect, but then indeed it averages out. So the question here is like, how do you do that on a personal level? So maybe you need to have personalized nudging. But I think it's important to consider here more overall, is the net effect zero, and but still means that some people do better, or are we by doing it causing some people to do worse, right? So that I think is a big question, because if we say the cost is low and so the risk is low, there's no reason really not to do it, because you'll take 2 or 3% saving. I mean, it's not nothing. That's really good, but if it goes at the expense of doing other things, then you might question, like, is this the right approach to get the type of behavior that we think we want, or that is sustainable?
Thanks. What I just wondered whether you used the kind of feedback device for the smart meters, or which kind of feedback device you used, because upon all we know, at least in Germany, it's quite seldom to have good feedback devices, and Without feedback device, the smart meter alone doesn't count anything, so, or doesn't need serve a lot. So this would be quite interesting. What was the setting in the different countries?
If you have more insight on what BG used exactly? Oh, putting you a bit on the spot here, but...
Yeah, there was also a whole debate because we had one more, like for the German case, we had one more simple web portal which can be just easily accessed based on the browser on your PC. And then we also had an app for the smart charging device. And there was also some debate which is more handy, which is more accessible. And surprisingly, also some people were just happy to have the more simple web portal with some basic information that works them pretty well for them. Yeah, but then this also, I mean, there's a whole debate in Germany, but I guess all over Europe about smart metering. There was also the requirement to install additional sensors that are then compatible with this kind of devices. Yes.
Any questions from the back side of the room are also welcome. Only the first 3 rows speak.
How did you recruit the participants to the test? Oh, I should say, my name is Chris Merveille. I'm from Goyaner, a cooperative in the north of Spain.
Yeah, so participation depended on the pilot. So for the example in Germany, these were users of a product that was being developed or is being developed by a company called BG. So they were recruited. We had in the Greek example, it was a software startup, so they recruited their users that are already on the platform. In the case of Belgium, it was just simply the class, and we had the pupils. So it depended a bit. I think you, in all of those, have a self-selection effect, of course, partly, except in the Belgian case, it was just the kids. So the pilot was kind of determinant of how people were recruited. But I must also add, it was really a struggle to get the numbers, right? Because it wasn't easy to achieve the numbers, because it's also, you have to spend a lot of work to get to like 100 consumers, and even 100, it's very hard then to do very detailed statistics, because you can't control for everything. Yeah.
I wanted to build on that selection. I mean, is there an observation or a danger that the nudging leads to an anti-nudging reaction? You know, some people, if you nudge too much, they do the opposite because they like to do the opposite of what certain people say. I'm not sure whether this has increased, this tendency today compared to former times. But maybe you made some observation, and if not, the question builds on what you said. Was there perhaps a pre-selection of the people who participated?
Yeah, I mean, the selection effect is certainly there, and we're pretty transparent in acknowledging that, because that was just required to get to these 5 field trials. Whether there's necessarily a way where people are like, well, then I do the opposite, I'm not so sure. Actually, the sample selection should work against that in some way, that people are like, okay, I'm interested in these tools, I want to do it. And that connects a little bit to what Nies was asking, that would it look different, would responsiveness look a bit different if this was a different sample, because they're probably not representative of the general population of these countries. But even there, I think it's even a bigger surprise that we still have like such a substantial and consistent share of non-respondents, because people selected into these programs, and the selection effect should work against the responsiveness decrease. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Arek Diakon from Wrocław University of Environmental and Life Sciences in Poland. My question is maybe a funny one. What are your achievements during this application use? Because I'm asking because sometimes it's better, you know, easier to engage people if you can show them, look, I'm using it and these are my results. You know, sometimes, because, you know, many people don't want to be a battlefield. So they prefer, you know, to test something if someone is from our neighbors or some colleagues or whatever use it already. And if we can show them, look, it works, then it's easier to disseminate this kind of results and apps or whatever. So what are your experience in that field?
I think maybe that question is better asked to the people who develop the apps. I'm just a simple person who looks at data. But I think you raise a good point, right? The proof is in the pudding. So if you have something that shows that you can decrease your consumption, that you have a lower energy bill, I think that is a kind of speaks for itself. The nature of the research project, of course, it stops before that. And we hope that the results that we have, especially for the partners who are more involved with software development, and I'm thinking of the colleagues in Greece, but also the colleagues in Germany, are able to translate these results and build an application that does exactly what you are saying. It shows people that, yes, I can increase my self-consumption and therefore have lower energy bills. But I think the best person to answer that is more people from industry, Anne and myself, maybe not the most qualified.
Yeah, I mean, we're researchers and that's our job is to do these evaluations, but part of the project is also that in each pilot there was sort of a national event where the people who participated in the project could come and have a discussion, and they were shown some of the results and they were also asked for their feedback. And Sabine and I just attended the German national event a couple of weeks ago, and we were really impressed with how deeply people cared, how engaged they were, and also how they challenged scientific results, how they wanted to give both positive and critical feedback about these tools that we developed from them. It didn't seem like, at least for the people who attended these events, that they were like, okay, the project's done, we move on. So we have some hopes that there are some spreader effects, but for the specific goals and what we evaluated in the project, yeah, it was not part of it.
Another question on, well, let's say monitoring and verification of savings, and also in the context of how these behavioral interventions might be used in a policy setting. Member states, utilities, might decide to use nudges to save energy. And then the question comes, well, how can we distinguish the microphones? How can we distinguish the effects? In our case, we had the impact of a pandemic, we had the impact of an energy crisis. Could utilities say with certainty, I saved 5% from the nudges? Could they actually use this number in their monitoring towards national authorities? Like, because you did the analysis, I mean, you found that certain things work, certain not. So maybe a discussion on this.
Yeah, I mean, statistical analysis is never certainty, right? But we're fairly confident that the average effects that we estimate are a good gauge of what you might expect if you scale it, especially because they contain the people who didn't respond so much. And if you want to use nudging as a policy tool, then you have to acknowledge that when you roll this out to a wider population, you will get something similar, right? The question is then, okay, like, if we actually try to use nudging interventions in policy settings at a utility level, then I really have to look at, okay, like when I scale it, how does my population maybe change? How do we go across different groups and do a wider effort? And I think this is something that's really important, that when we look at behavioral interventions and really using them, then I have to look at whether this intervention works, but our results also clearly show that you also have to look at, okay, in my setting, in my target group, is this a good timing? Does it fit with the regulatory incentives instead of just rolling out a nudge because some researcher told you it's 2% savings, right? Like, we need to think a little bit more about the picture, about the environment in which people make their energy choices.
Clear, thank you. Any last question? If not, great. We proceed to the MICAT project. Thank you both very much. So representing MidCat, we have Frederik Berger from Fraunhofer, who is working on the socially acceptable implementations of climate and energy policy measures, and of course the multiple impacts. And Felix from Wuppertal, who is a senior researcher and a project coordinator, and works on developing the integrated home renovation services and the evaluation of multiple impacts. Over to you.
Hi everyone. Yeah, we're presenting today the multiple impacts calculation tool and the project behind it that produced it. So starting off, what are multiple impacts? You might know them rather as multiple benefits. So basically the whole, if you made it this far in the energy bubble without knowing what multiple benefits are, well, congrats. But generally speaking, it's about all the benefits that arise beyond just saving energy when, well, you save energy. And we decided to go for the term multiple impacts rather than multiple benefits in order to have a more rational approach and also look at the inconveniences that come alongside with energy efficiency. For instance, it can have negative impact on demand response potentials for renewables. But there's a couple of things that can be worse with energy efficiency, and we want to have a neutral approach to this. And this has gained quite some relevance in the course of our project as the new EED, which Nives talked about earlier on, has included the Article 3, which requires before you do energy supply investment to check whether it would be more cost effective to do energy demand reduction and include in there the multiple benefits that could arise. So that's been included in the Article 3 that has to be implemented in national law, of course, and that's going to take for a while. And a lot of actors don't really know how to handle this, and we are providing a tool that might help do this. Now, this didn't come out of nowhere. So there were projects before that worked on these things. There's been publications that go back decades, and a major one was the one we cited there by the IEA in 2014. And our project is kind of the love child of two former projects. On the one hand, the Combi project by Wuppertal, which they did a great job in quantifying multiple benefits and monetizing them, looking at a 2030 target and different ambitions. And on the other hand, the Odyssey Muir multiple benefits facility, which looked at the multiple benefits that arised thanks to the energy efficiency measures implemented in the past. And the idea of this was to kind of merge both approaches in order to create a tool that allows to quantify and monetize multiple impacts for any given measure, scenario, policy whatsoever that users have on their hand. So kind of to automate this whole process. And that has been quite a massive step, because before we always had clearly curated data that we could input and have results, and now suddenly we had to work with the mess that people have on their hands. And so it has been quite a bit of work, and we had to dig deep into a lot of assumptions and ways to get to certain data that are typically hard to get in everyday life. So our tool has been designed with like two main goals in back of our heads. On the one hand, we wanted to have something really straightforward, so anyone who wants some quick results can get results. So it means a lot of default values and assumptions that go into it. But on the other hand, it should also be possible for people, for instance, those who want to comply with the Article 3 of the EED, to improve the data that is used for those calculations. And in order to have this in a very transparent way, we also went for the open source approach, which also brings whole new levels of complexity in terms of documentations and other things, so other people might use this tool after all. So a lot of work went to do this project to get this tool. And also, we didn't just want to use the knowledge we gathered, or others gathered in previous projects. We also wanted to use the knowledge that is there where people need this tool. So we went on 3 different governmental levels. On the one hand, we talked with EU officials, but we also went on a national level. We talked with German, Polish, and Italian officials. But we also had 3 pilot cities across Europe, one in Estonia, Tartu, and 2 in Spain, Vitoria-Gasteiz, and on Mallorca, 1 municipality. And we asked them in 3 steps, kind of on one hand, what do they need for this? What are the kind of inputs they can provide? What are kind of tools they can work with? And also, while we're programming this tool alongside, showing them the steps and kind of getting their feedback on what is easy to use, what is complicated, where are barriers for them to really use this in everyday life and in their processes, because all municipalities, but also all other governmental levels, always have a lot of them on their plate, and it can't take forever to quantify those things. So, the project team has been quite interesting, quite diverse. So on the one hand, we've been coordinating this project, and we've also been programming the tool behind it and had some indicators as well. Wuppertal has done a lot of work when it came to the whole framework for quantifying, monetizing multiple benefits, but also cost-benefit analysis, and they also worked on social indicators. We had E3 modeling on board, which provided data and also worked on economic indicators. IASA worked on the ecologic indicators. We had ICP connecting us with the institutions and member states. ICLE has linked us to the local level. They've been handling the needs of the communities and stayed in contact with them. And WISE Europe also helped with communication and dissemination. Right, and that's where I give over.
Thank you, Frederick. I will continue with some insights on how the quantification framework in MiCAT is designed. And in this figure here, you can see this general quantification approach of the MiCAT tool, where the quantification chain is with the individual steps is shown here in the center. And first, tool users are asked to enter input data in terms of energy savings to describe their respective use case, such as a customized energy efficiency scenario or policy measure. And based on these inputs, the tool then quantifies the multiple impacts in the different categories on the basis of impact factors or functions. And where possible, these impacts are then also monetized, aggregated, and included in a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis. And on the following slides, I will try to explain each of these steps in a bit more detail. Yeah, now to the first step, the impact quantification based on the input data entered by the tool users. And as the overall aim of MiCAT was to make the tool applicable for a broad target group and for a wide range of use cases, the calculation of indicators is based on impact factors or functions that are directly linked to the energy savings. And these impact factors are derived from the models of our partners, such as the Gemini 3 model for macroeconomic impacts, or the GAINS model for air pollution, or the development is based on research findings and empirical data. The tool users can also enter further optional parameters, such as energy prices, fuel splits, and so on. But this is optional. But increases, of course, the accuracy of results, and so it's also recommended to add further data. And with this relatively straightforward approach, I would say MiCAT can support the target groups with their assessment and reporting of the multiple impacts, and it's particularly suitable for, let's say, public authorities and so on, who do not have sufficient own resources and capacities for very complex modeling. And the aim is to facilitate thereby the assessment and reporting of the multiple impacts at the 3 governance levels we have looked into, the EU, national and local levels. However, given the limitations of such an online tool, it of course cannot replace very detailed modeling of the multiple impacts and very detailed policy impact assessments of policy. The second main step in the MiCAT tool is then the monetization of the multiple impacts by converting the physical impacts into the monetary values. And this is necessary to be able to compare their size for aggregation and for including them in the cost-benefit analysis. This is also important because previous research has shown that those multiple impacts in monetary terms are very significant and often higher than the energy cost savings. So including them in a cost-benefit analysis is important also to avoid biased policy decisions and so on. And the monetization approach in the MICAT project is to apply specific monetization factors to the physical values, such as societal costs of carbon and so on. And we provide in the MICAT tool default values for such monetization factors. And these are mainly based on recommendations from institutions such as the WHO and so on. But the tool users can also modify those monetization factors that are provided as default if they have different preferences for such factors. Yeah, now to the last two steps in the tool, the impact aggregation and CBA. In terms of aggregation, monetary impacts are only summed up in the tool and included in the CBA when there is no risk for double counting. So we are taking here a conservative approach to avoid an overestimation of the aggregated results. And so far, 8 different monetized impacts can be considered in the CBA mode. These include the energy cost savings, of course, then greenhouse gas emission reductions, impacts on renewable targets, avoided investments in additional energy supply capacity, and also 4 health-related indicators, either due to reduced air pollutants or due to an improved indoor climate due to energy efficiency refurbishments. In terms of other features of the CBA, users can do a sensitivity analysis by adjusting several parameters such as discount rates, energy prices, and also investments. And several CBA indicators can be calculated in the tool, including the standard net present value calculator, net present value, annuity benefit cost ratios, but also levelized costs in euro per kilowatt hour and marginal abatement cost curves. And I think this is all I wanted to say now on the methodology, and would hand back to you, Frederick, to demonstrate the tool. And I think then the steps become more clear.
Hope so. We've been pushed a lot to publish a tool, and since the end of the project is awaiting in a month, it actually went online today and is available on our website, MICAT.eu. I'd still give you a short tour so to acclimatize you to using it. And this is our landing page, but before I go into the specifics of this tool, I wanted to think about a use case to apply the tool. And walking through the European district here, I saw a lot of big shiny buildings, among others the Europa building of the Council of Europe, of the European Union, the Parlement, and also the European Parliament. And I heard from a reliable source that they could do with a bit of insulation. And so I actually crunched the numbers, and so what this could actually bring to insulate those buildings. So the Council of Europe could bring 0.35 kiloton oil equivalents, the European Commission 1.2 kiloton of oil equivalents, and the Parliament's even 3.3 kilotons of oil equivalents. Right, and I added the dates, so we have like a scenario when we would insulate those buildings. And now let's look at the tool, how to use it. All right, so back to this front page, and what you see here is, there's a time frame. So the idea is, on the one hand, you can look at measures in the past, as was the case with the multiple benefits facility of Odyssey-Muir, but you can also look in the future, and in this case, we want to insulate buildings in the future. You can select the region. We have all 27 countries and the EU level, which often use a weighted average of the EU countries when there is no data available. But as we said, for the local level, we also allow the selection of municipality or regions, And the idea there is basically to type in the population, because we, through a lot of little studies, let's call it that way, we found out that a lot of those values we would need to scale best with population. So that's the first approach we took there. So if you have a small region, if you take Brussels, you just type in 1 million inhabitants, and then the values would be scaled. And finally, we also allow to use different input units. So we use kiloton of oil equivalents because the Commission is just such a massive building. But if you're like on a smaller level, we can also use gigawatt hours, or I think also joule. So that's also a thing we want to do here. And what you also see at the bottom is learn more. That's a link to our documentation, which is quite extensive. So on the one hand, we describe in text how our values are calculated, how we get to our assumptions, but also we included the tickets, so basically how we programmed it, so the mathematical calculations behind it that went into the indicators, the modules in between, and so on and so forth. Right, so that's how this first page looks, and typing in these values, I would click on Start, and then I'd be asked to add a little more. We still see the same options as we had before in the top left corner, and then we should add the time frame. So I added 4 years, so on the one hand the year we have right now, the year the European Council is being installated, same for the Commission and the Parliament. And then I would need to specify the kind of measure I want to do here. So the idea is we needed to streamline measures into different categories so we could easily assess the multiple impacts. So we built kind of categories called improvement actions, which bring together actions that affect similarly multiple impacts. And those are, for instance, insulating the building envelope, or replacing the heating system in a building, or behavioral measures. And these kind of things we subdivided, and then we also differ between sectors. And using this, you can kind of specify the measure or the program you want to address. So for instance, if you want to go to if you have a program that has a component that goes on building envelope and one component that is more about replacing the heating, you could just click on the plus and have your two kind of measures included there, and even give it a name on the top and assess it. So here I chose average tertiary, since buildings are tertiary buildings, and envelope installation. I think the picture was quite clear on that. And also added the figures I crunched yesterday. And then I would click on Analyze. And that's what our results look like. As Felix said, we have quite a lot of results. So each result, we have 3 categories in terms of our quantification: the social benefits, the economic benefits, and the environmental benefits. For each benefit, we have this graph and a description on the top. Furthermore, so let's go through those. So we have a variety of indicators across those categories, and also the monetization below. Once again, quite similar. And finally, we also have this cost-benefit analysis, where you can change those parameters to do a kind of a sensitivity analysis and find out how this actually affects the calculations. Right, that's actually it. But before we're quite there, they'll take the time to actually show the real tool, because we also have some kind of nice features, like those little e-dots you saw, that allow you to show some additional information when you're stuck somewhere. And it always gives you a short text and leads you then to documentation where there's a more extensive explanation of what it actually means. So yeah, as I said, the tool is available on micaltool.eu. It's still a beta version, so if you see a mistake, could be some flukes maybe found their way into the tool, there's actually an email address, mine unfortunately, so just send an email if you see something, and we'll try to fix it as soon as possible. So yeah, here we are on our beautiful project website, and there's the banner right there. And here we are. So now if you can see, you can click, for instance, on the little dot next to the time frame, and it gives you an explanation what it actually means, whether you choose past or future, how it actually affects your calculation and the results. And also, if you go and learn more, or documentation, which is kind of the same, you get onto our documentation page, a lot of different explanations regarding the different things that went into the program. All right. I think it's not for me to ask the questions.
On the very good presentation, and definitely a tool to explore much, much more. We do have another 15 minutes or so for questions, so I think we can use the whole time. Yes.
Hello, I'm Kostas from the Biku project. First of all, thank you very much for the tool. It is very nice. I wanted to ask you two questions, actually. The first one is, since when this tool is going to be online? And the second one has to do about the methodology of the social impact. If you based on a particular methodology or you developed something on your own. About the calculation of the energy poverty, of the creation of new jobs, etc.
Do you want, so, yeah.
Yes, I will respond to this as I was responsible for developing the methodology. And yes, we built that on a methodology that we had developed for the European Commission to assess impacts within impact assessments for the EPBD reform in 2016, and most recently the EED recast also. So this is a newly developed method, and we're currently working on a paper, so we will publish the methodology in detail. So, and of course we welcome any feedback on the methodology to really spark also scientific debate about this.
And the tool is online since today? Okay. Just for you. How many years? Wait, it's how long it's going to be active? Oh, for quite a while. We have a follow-up project. So yeah, the commission actually did like the first version, so it's going to be there for a while. Odyssey Muir is older than I am, so I guess we're quite a couple of years ahead.
You will hear more this afternoon about the following project.
Now it should work, yeah. I'm Alexander Husenbeet, I'm from Germany, and I'm involved in some think tank activities. I have two questions. On the one side, I recently read in a book from Harvard about healthy buildings, that when you look at a lot of factors, usually $300, for example, go on payroll, $30 go on rent, and only $3 go on the operation, on the energy bill of a building. And now I would like to know, I really like the tool in the sense that you see all the different impacts, and I would like to know if we can see it in an example, how we can, for example, increase the impact on payroll in a building and at the same time influence the energy efficiency, for example. And the second question is that there is a simulator, it's called En-ROADS from the MIT, and they look globally on solutions, how they impact each other. And I just want to know if there's any collaboration or implication with the En-ROADS team.
So let me start with question number 2, since it's more straightforward. No, there isn't. We had a lot of collaborations with several groups because, as I said, it's not really like a niche topic anymore. So not really. Furthermore, I think one aspect that we have to keep in mind with this tool is it's indicator based, so it means they don't affect each other. So the more you go into modeling, the further away you go from what this tool does, because one weakness of the previous tool, Combi, which is great with the results, was that it took 2 minutes to load. And you'd think 2 minutes is nothing compared to the results, but it was one of the main flaws that was identified. And this tool does it like in a snap. So it was all about being like straightforward. And the first question, to be honest, we both kind of struggled to understand what you were referring to. Please do.
Let me contest a bit the figures. The energy share that you mentioned seems very low, and I would suppose this is the case of a person that is extremely rich. But we have persons where energy is, I think, up to 20% of the income, and especially when you look to last year where the energy prices were exploding, I think we are in a very different context. But I apologize if I misunderstood the intention.
Yeah, as I said, it's from the US. It's a book published from Harvard researchers. And of course, in the US, energy prices are different than here. But still, like a lot of, when we look in industry and corporates and so on, very often energy efficiency is very low in the priority. And other factors such as the payroll or the rent of buildings is a much bigger factor. And that's why I like the program, and that's why I wanted to see in the end, for example, how can we see the different impacts? Because in the end, if a company makes 10% more profit by 1% more energy waste, then in the end they wouldn't really care.
So, talking about this. So talking about this, there's actually a better project for this. It's the M-Benefits project, which looked at more how can we embed multiple benefits into the strategy of companies. Because as you said, it's not really on the forefront when it comes to the bottom line, but they found ways to show that actually it can strategically improve the position of a company. And that's what they have been addressing. So more not having it as a dot on the balance sheet, but rather in the strategy of a company. In here, I'd say it's one of many things, but companies, can use it, of course, but are not the main addressees of the tool.
Yeah, sorry, again, me. Yes, first of all, congrats that the tool is online. I mean, we discussed kind of preliminary state in the workshop as well, a couple of months before. And now I think in the workshop we also had the idea whether it would be a good way to make kind of test runs for each country or for a selection of country or so. I mean, this will just come as you just went online now, but I wondered whether you just thought about it again, and maybe also in the context of the energy crisis, it could be a good context to look a bit closer at the different factors of the energy savings, for example. Or I don't know, maybe there are certainly really a couple of interesting questions or test runs to do with, but I think it would be maybe a good idea as well to make it more known in the countries. Maybe to do it as well with partners together, like in Germany you had the DENEF, or I don't know, but yeah, that's...
So yeah, so on the one hand we have this thing with DENEF we discussed back then in Germany, but unfortunately this is just one of many deliverables that are still outstanding and pending, and one of them are the policy briefs, and in there we definitely planned on looking at certain use cases and kind of draft what would it mean to do this certain policy in a country. For instance, something that has been asked so often by you is the super bonus in Italy, because it's so controversial, and that would be one of the policies that you can just like target and see what are the results we could get from this kind of stuff. And so put it in a perspective and also in a narrative, and put it in context looking at energy prices and all these things.
Yeah, for Germany it would be super, in my eyes, a super important framing to show that efficiency standard or the maps, for example, are not the cost driver. Especially in the recent political debate there. So yeah, therefore it's really important and a good tool. Thanks for it.
Maybe one more technical question on that. So regarding we've done also a meta-analysis of all the various values on the multiple benefits for the Regio first and the other projects we work together. And what we see there is that what you see in several countries that have carried out such small analysis, the differences are mainly on the impact to the GDP. So in terms of the employment and all that, the figures that you used are quite close to what Prodessa and other projects did, so it seems quite to be okay. For the GDP, there are different values normally used in countries. So I don't know how we tackle with that at some point. Do we harmonize? Do we use kind of an average? Or I've seen from 0.8 up to 3 up to 4% impacts on GDP from efficiency.
To be honest, as was the case with new trends, I'm no economics expert, and once again, E3M did the job by providing factors from their GEMI3 model. So I'm not quite sure, honestly. I think there it is. Yes. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So I think.
On this one, I didn't follow this particular work. I was on the new trend, so I cannot, let's say, directly clarify.
And a final question from Didier and Lucas, and then we're done.
Thank you. Pardon, please, go ahead. Go ahead, my Andrew. Please, go ahead.
Does it work? Yeah. Lucas Kranzl, TU Wien. First of all, thanks for the great presentation and the project and the tool. Looks really great. I have a bit of fundamental question, let's say, which is I feel a bit ambiguous, let's say, regarding this monetizing everything. And on the one hand, I see the value because obviously, in some discussions, only euro count and nothing else. But on the other hand, I also see the risk that, again, there is some parts are lost, and some and these parts are even more neglected if you monetize some of these impacts. So the question is first, you mentioned that you monetized most or some of the impacts. Could you say a bit, let's say, about which share of these impacts you were able to monetize? And second, also, yeah, I guess you also discussed these questions in the consortium. Could you a bit reflect on it?
Yeah, I counted them yesterday, and we have monetized 8 impact indicators so far out of 23, so around 1/3. But we still plan to probably monetize more, latest when the seed MICAD project, the follow-up project, will start. So yeah, roughly around 1/3 so far. So not all of them, of course, only then when it makes somehow sense.
Yeah, so as you said, I think a couple of indicators we have are quite similar and are just different ways to show it, so it doesn't make sense to monetize them both. And then we also have things like energy poverty. I mean, what's the value of someone being lifted out of energy poverty? I mean, we already have the value of a life, and that was quite striking to see that those strongly differ across Europe. So that's already quite wild. I mean, within the European Union is one thing, but I think between Germany and Turkmenistan is a factor of 1,000, which is, yeah, quite tough. So I think, yeah, you name it, it's very difficult, and in many cases I didn't really like the whole monetization aspect, because once again, when we talk about import dependency, what are we going to take as a cost? Are we going to take the whole economy, how it now kind of shrunk because of this import dependency, or are we just going to take the marginal cost difference between Russian oil and German oil, which typically the Russian one is cheaper? So it's very tough to kind of monetize those. And so even for those, the indicators we did monetize, we do have margins of errors, of course. And it couldn't be any different, especially if you use default values. But what we always thought about when we discussed this was that the status quo is very often you don't consider them at all. So now we bring in quite a massive statistical error and margins, but we remove an even bigger systematic mistake and error margin we had before by including them. But there's still so much discussion to be had around like the value of so many of those indicators.
Thank you. And we had the last question from Didier, and then
thank you.
We can have lunch.
You mentioned, if I have well understood, that the starting point is energy savings. Okay? So take the case of one country. So I take the total energy saving from one country. which is a very rare data. I think it exists only in Odyssey. The issue there is no breakdown of these savings by fuel type. For example, savings coming from gas, coal, and so on. So how you can monetize, you take an average, because if I make electricity saving or coal savings, it has a huge impact on the CO2 cost. So I have this is a clarification. Now it's more, let's say, pragmatic question. Okay, I see a nice project, but I see no result in terms of quantitative result. And for me, I judge a project not if you have a nice software, but if I see some numbers. For instance, imagine that you have a cost of a project which is 100 euro per TOE saved, without any cost benefit, okay? If we add all the cost benefit, do we go to 120 or 400? What is the level of magnitude in the total cost of the project per TOE saved if we include or not your result? It's a magnitude of 10% or it's a magnitude of factor 3?
Right. To start off, the first one, how do we involve the energy splits, for instance, energy mixes? So it's quite long calculation that is in the database, because what we need is, of course, an energy mix on an improvement action level, but it is kind of an energy mix you never have. Or I can't expect the town of Vitoria-Gasteiz in Spain to just have this out of the blue. What they do often have are sectoral energy mixes. So we kind of have a calculation, we have coefficients that show how are the energy carriers within one subsector splitting up on the improvement actions within them. And these can then be multiplied and normalized, and then we get the value. So we have default values. Of course, it's also possible to change it by the sort of user says, I think this is going to be safe, because it's also a discussion to be had. What is saved in terms of electricity? I mean, how electricity is produced is not, it's not the energy mix at the end of a year we see on the website of Eurostat that tells us which energy carrier is going to be the first one or to which extent it's going to be saved. So this is something we're also working on, to have like this kind of merit order and also on longer term scales, the information what kind of energy carriers are actually going to be removed if we reduce by 10% our whole energy consumption. So that's something we're still working on. The second question is, while we're still going to produce results in the policy briefs, which will exactly answer your question if it's 20% more or 400% more, we saw our main aim in providing you with the tool to do it yourself. Because don't want to trash any other projects, but now we provide you and everyone with a simple tool to actually do this for exactly the scenarios you need, because you might want to change little things in the scenario and not always call me up and ask me for the results. So although those results are going to come in those policy briefs, the strength of this tool is for you to be able to play around with it yourself, as long as you have a computer or phone. Yeah.
Good. Well, then a big round of applause to our speakers. Thank you very much. Very interesting project. And the closing from Heike.
Does it? Yes. Okay. Yeah, we're ready for the lunch break. Thanks again to all the speakers. I think it was really great to get such an insight for all the projects. I hope to those who haven't heard about the projects yet, they also got a great insight. I definitely think so. Okay. Thanks.